intelligence is such a big factor in how we experience the world. And I'd like to explore a case for why it is something that we should be able to talk about, because I think that people at various points on that bell curve have different experiences and different capacities.
You must be some kind of therapist?
I am some kind of therapist, and I'm about to take you on a journey through the inner wilderness. I've invited brilliant guests from all walks of life to join me as we investigate, illuminate, and inspire transformation in ourselves, intimate relationships, and the social ecosystems we are constellated in. What you are about to hear may surprise you, so hang on to your earbuds for a hefty dose of sanity in a chaotic world. I am Stephanie Wynn, a licensed marriage and family therapist, branching out and building bridges between psychology and everything else under the sun. It's my honor to have you along for the ride. Let's get started. I am so excited to welcome to the show today my dear long-term friend, Dirk van Leeuwen from Alameda, California. Well, you're not actually originally from Alameda. Tell us where you're from.
Sure. I was born in Hamilton, Ontario, and spent the first 5 years of my life mostly in Canada, and moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan when I was 5, and spent most of my childhood there. Went to college in Philadelphia, spent a few years up in Boston, then back to Philadelphia, and have been in California, I guess, the past 13 years, which seems like a long time now that I think about it. I studied philosophy in college, but it's hard to get paid to do that professionally if you don't actually want to go into academia. And I didn't. I am still the only person in a nuclear family that did not go into academia. And what I did instead was I started working with, in special education, but not just special education. I worked with developmentally disabled adults as well. Coming from this sort of very academic family, I was really curious about the other side of the spectrum coming out of college, and particularly, studying philosophy. I'd studied philosophy of language was one of the focus areas that I was really looking into. And, I began out of college working with the autistic community. And the reason that I wanted to, work with this particular community was because of the language deficit that they had. After spending all of this time thinking about how language shapes reality for most of us, what does that mean for somebody who, has a 300-word vocabulary? What is their reality like? And of course, there's other complications of this when you talk about the autistic community. But that's really kind of what got me interested in doing that straight out of school. I mean, this is about 20 years ago at this point. That then led to, eventually teaching special education back in Philadelphia with more of a conventional high school. Like I taught at a charter school for 3 years, and then was the special education coordinator at a K-8 school, another charter school. But all in all, only taught for about 5 years before getting to the point where it didn't feel like there was a lot of opportunity to change the way that things worked from within the system, and felt like I couldn't spend my life doing it. Moved on, had a kid, moved out to California, got a job in tech, e-commerce.
I agree that we are more than what we do professionally, and you've always been a philosophically and psychologically minded person, and you're going to carry that wherever you go. I think part of living a fulfilling life is maintaining our creativity and curiosity. But I do love that you introduced yourself from the standpoint of having gone from this very academic family to working with developmentally disabled children. So you've really experienced the gamut of the reaches of what the human intellect can do, as well as where it can be impaired. And you said, in reflecting on what we might want to talk about today, that you've been researching IQ. So it seems like that's relevant. And I'm so curious to hear what you've been learning.
Well, yeah, I mean, it absolutely is. I mean, to a lot of things. I think it's kind of become one of these unspoken assumptions that we have in our society and in not even just our society. I think global society, there's things that we kind of take for granted and never really question. And having worked with this population, when I was younger, and again, it's been 13 years or so, there's a wide variety of intellectual capabilities in the world. I think one way to look at it is that half of the population has a below average IQ. And, a few months back, I was sort of thinking about this relative to where we are in the United States and this strange political divide that I think that we've ended up in, where I don't think I'm the only one who feels that we're in a divided country at this point. And understanding exactly like what are the fractures, where are the lines, where did things crack, and trying to piece that together led me to this point where I was thinking about one thing very specifically. When I delved into this research into the variety of human intelligence, and it was this idea that I see particularly coming from, I would say, the left broadly, but I don't think it's limited to that. I think it's something that we sort of take for granted as a society, but it becomes more accentuated, I think, in mainstream liberal perspective on things, as well as, even further left from there. This idea that in a very similar way to, how conservatives might talk about financial success, and it really being this thing where it's like, well, you either just put the effort in and you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And if you just work hard enough and put the time in, you too, can be wealthy and successful. And if you're not, by implication, well, that's probably your fault. You could have done more. You could have worked harder. And you just didn't work hard enough. And the people who are successful are the ones that put the time in. I think a lot of people, from a left perspective anyway, kind of take it for granted that this is a myth. But they do the same thing when it comes to intellect, when it comes to academic success. And there's been a lot written about this ever since Trump was elected. And this sort of notion of the white working class and their grievance towards political and cultural elites who maybe they perceive as looking down on them. It really occurred to me, particularly you have, I guess, maybe the most popular cultural figure that does this quite blatantly would be somebody like a Bill Maher, who just openly talks about Americans being stupid. But I mean, it's not just him. It's something you see in memes that get shared. I remember, back in I don't know how far back it was, but it's one that's not uncommon in places like Facebook and places where people, go to argue with their relatives about politics and things like that, where they'll show a map of the United States, like red and blue states together, and as well as the relative IQ score average of the people in those states to illustrate, well, yeah, the red states, they're just not as smart as us, and that's why they vote for the Republicans. You can even look at Thomas Frank wrote this book, What's the Matter with Kansas, back in the early 2000s, and even the title is just sort of asking this question. It's well, why is it that, there are these conservative voters that are so stupid they get hoodwinked by the Republicans to vote against their own economic interests for some cultural reason, I think is usually the implication. But even beyond that is just this idea that these rubes out there aren't as smart as the rest of us and, are easily fooled by somebody like a Donald Trump. And why don't they get it? And so listening to just the discourse within our society and, reading commentary and things like that. And noticing that this is subtext to a lot of what's coming from the left in our society.
Mm.
And, having this background as being a special education teacher, one of the things that I remember getting my teaching certification during this period and learning in more detail about, how intellectual impairment affects people. Like, people's score on something like the IQ test generally doesn't change. Now, there's a period and you can't really, give an IQ test to like a 3-year-old. But in early years of development, there's a lot of environmental conditions that can have an impact on what that score ends up being later in life. But, once you get to grade school age, the various assessments that they have to, figure out a child's intellectual capability, it's not going to change a whole lot if the kid takes the test at 7 and then takes the test again at 18 or as an adult, when they're 30, 40 years old. There might be, a point or two difference, but generally speaking, you're locked into it. You're not going to get a lot smarter in terms of what we consider to be raw intellectual capability just by working harder and studying harder.
I understand you're bringing up a couple of main points to dive into. One of them is that I hear you deconstructing some myths that you view as especially prevalent on the left about what intelligence is and how malleable it is. You're saying that we have a lot of evidence that intelligence as measured by IQ is something that's fairly fixed, and that there are some unhelpful narratives you believe, especially on the left, about why don't people just work harder if they're not getting it. And so it seems like that's a conversation for us to get into. I also hear you interweaving with that the narratives about the left sort of looking down on the right and perceiving them as less intelligent. So in that, there's an intellectual rigidity where, on the one hand, some people on the left, as you see it, view themselves as morally or intellectually superior to others. And then there's the assumption that if others don't share their views, if they're further right on the political spectrum, that it's due to a lack of intelligence, which I think is also not necessarily the full truth. And we could talk about it more from a moral psychology and sociology standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got it right. And this is really the point I was getting to, is that in exploring this, what I thought was going to be a relatively narrow point that I wanted to make in some way about the left feeling like, being smart means that they deserve it. It is this idea of the meritocracy, and like they got to where they are in terms of their social, cultural, intellectual cred from like working hard, ignoring the component of it that there is certainly a lottery that's happening in the background before you're born, not just for how much money your parents have, but also your genetics and your kind of innate capabilities from an intellectual standpoint. You don't have any control over it. And not only do you not really have any control over it, there's not a lot of control to be had. I mean, again, those first 5 years of development, there are very definitely environmental factors that can influence an individual's intellectual development, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lead poisoning, I think, is the one that most people would be familiar with. Sodium deficiency is another one that we could potentially get into. But what I really want to say is, like, I started looking at it from this standpoint. Everyone on the left thinks of this bootstrapping idea for financial success is kind of bogus. The point is that the same thing sort of happens, as far as the left is concerned. They don't address it. And what they end up doing is believing that, the fact that they went to an Ivy League school, they got a job in media, that puts them in a position where, like, yeah, I'm here and my opinion and my perspective matters because I worked harder, I deserve it. And, there's a lot that's been written about it recently. The book that I've read that I think probably does it best is called The Tyranny of Merit. It's something that's there in the discourse as well, and that's what piqued my interest into it. What I found out, when I actually started to do some research around IQ and intellectual capabilities, led to like the entire can of worms that you're talking about right now, which is why it's hard to kind of nail down, a specific direction to go in this conversation, because it is such a can of worms. Just going to the library for the first time and trying to find a book about intelligence, how it's been measured historically, kind of stops at like 1994. At least what was available in the local Alameda library, when this book by Charles Murray, I forget who his co-author was, but it's quite famous and notoriously considered, untouchable in polite society for being somehow racist, called The Bell Curve.
Right.
Which was an examination of, how disparity within our society impacts social and economic outcomes in terms of, whether or not you do better on something like, an IQ test, or whether you don't. And they make a solid case for that, the IQ test being a reasonably good indicator, right? Obviously not in every case. Any individual can deviate from what's expected. But when you're looking at populations generally, folks that have an IQ that's like 85 or under aren't going to perform as well in the United States, either academically or, whenever they end school and go into the work market. They're not going to make as much money. They're not going to have the same kind of outcomes as someone who is on the opposite end of the spectrum and is in the top 25 percentile for intelligence as measured by something like the IQ test.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast. If you like what you're hearing, now's a great time to like, subscribe, follow, rate, review, or share. You can also support the podcast by visiting sometherapist.com/shop, where you will find goods and services I have personally curated to support your well-being and enrich your life. We're just building the shop, so check back periodically and feel free to suggest recommendations. All right, now back to the show. So I hear you making a couple of big points here. One is about blind spots. We all have them, and you're describing some blind spots that you see on the left, right? So you're saying that the left is quick to point the finger at the right when it comes to the bootstrapping mentality about success. And yet it's also been your perception that many of those on the left who would point that finger do something similar when it comes to the narratives that they hold about intelligence, which is also a factor when it comes to success. And I think it's important that we look at blind spots, right? It's always easier to see someone else's blind spots than our own. So I think that's a really important point that you bring up. I also hear you making a case for why it's important to talk about intelligence and acknowledge the reality of different intellectual capacities. You pointed out that Charles Murray is a controversial figure, and right now there's a movement to reduce or eliminate things like gifted and talented programs. And I think people have a lot of tension and conflict about how we relate to the concept of intelligence, whether it's acceptable to talk about it, acceptable to acknowledge that there are differences, even though we have a lot of data on this, that IQ is a scientifically valid measure that predicts life outcomes in a lot of ways, right? And we know that it's a factor in psychological resilience as well. I personally credit a lot of my success to my intelligence because I've got a lot of other factors working against me. I have, an extensive history of trauma and have had a lot of setbacks. So I'm really grateful for my intelligence, but we do live in a time where it's hard to say things like that, right? Because that sort of acknowledgement of one's personal strengths looks very bad even though intelligence is such a big factor in how we experience the world. And I'd like to explore a case for why it is something that we should be able to talk about, because I think that people at various points on that bell curve have different experiences and different capacities. And, if you subject someone to education and experiences that are continuously far beyond their level, that's going to be really demoralizing and inhibit someone from trying and maybe create a state of learned helplessness. And
Yeah.
similarly, if you take someone who's really gifted or intellectually exceptional and put them in a regular environment and don't acknowledge that there is something different about them, then that can create a lot of problems as well, right? Whether it's being bullied for being the nerdy kid or being understimulated and then acting out. Something else I've seen in people who are really gifted is quite a bit of anger and frustration and disenchantment with the world. So I think about a friend of mine who's exceptional, probably has an IQ of like 180. I mean, just one of the smartest people I've ever met. And he described feeling really angry in preschool. And his inner dialogue at that time was like, yeah, I get it. It's the letter A. I got it the first time you told me that. Why are we going over this for the 30th time? 2 + 2 = 4. Got it. And he
Sure.
just went through life with this anger, like people are idiots. And now he lives a very eccentric life that works for him, where he can dive into what his interests are. But I think that when people aren't treated, frankly, as you are exceptional in this regard, and we're going to behave accordingly, when that's not given, it can create social problems. And I think people are so afraid of creating social problems by acknowledging giftedness, but there's a downside of not acknowledging it as well.
No, there absolutely is, and you talk about gifted and talented programs being closed down. I mean, the most famous recent story is in New York City. And gifted and talented programs do fall under the canopy of special education. It is still something that when I was working towards my teaching certification, we had to learn about that as well. But it's been de facto shut down across most of the country long before now. The only reason that New York City is notable is because the district is so large that they were actually capable of keeping their gifted and talented programs open up until this point, where it is now, because of the lack of racial diversity within those programs, being shut down as something that can't possibly be just. Frankly, the gifted and talented programs are mostly Asian kids in New York City at this point. And we haven't even gotten into this component of it, but the reason that this book by Charles Murray that came out in 1994, The Bell Curve, is controversial is because it does have one chapter where it acknowledges that there is a pretty striking racial disparity in terms of where different populations show up on the bell curve. And this is something that isn't necessarily easy to communicate over a podcast, right? And I don't have any slides to bring up, but
Mhm.
if you imagine, if you a bell curve, if you've never seen one, it's a way that statisticians express the normal distribution of different measurable qualities, among a population. And the easy one to sort of imagine, I'm a very tall man, so I know about this as well, is something like height, right? And the
Mhm.
average height is going to be in the middle, and imagine a bell-shaped curve that represents the population. Where, say, for men, if the average height for men is 5'9", somebody like myself who's almost 6'7", I'm going to be way on one end of the bell curve. There's only going to be about 1 in 1,000 people that are as tall as I am. Most of the population is going to be in the middle. 50% is going to be between, and I don't know these numbers exactly, but I'm just going to say, like, let's say between 5'5" and 6'3" or something like that,
Right.
for male height. And it works the same way for intelligence, and this is how the IQ test has really been structured and designed so that it does fit into this bell curve kind of shape. where most people, who know anything about the IQ test, if you ask one randomly on the street, they know that the average IQ is going to be 100. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're above 100, you're above average. If you're below 100, you're below average. Half the population is going to be over it. Half the population is going to be under it. And to understand it more clearly, when we talk about special education, we're talking about the tails on either end of this bell-shaped curve.
Mm-hmm.
And so to be in special education, you either need to have an IQ score that's going to be over 130, okay, which puts you in, actually less than 1% of the population. And then to be considered developmentally disabled or intellectually disabled, that's below a score below 70. And there's other components, behavioral components to it as well, to be legally considered developmentally disabled and fall into this population. And special education services go to kids that don't necessarily have an IQ that's either over 130 or below 70, but simply have a learning disability of some kind, like dyslexia or attention deficit disorder as well. But the traditional populations that people think of for gifted and talented, it's really measured by this test and where you are relative to the rest of the population. That population, the gifted and talented kids, they still have the same outcomes, regardless of whether or not they may be frustrated by the other preschoolers not being able to identify the letter A as quickly as this friend of yours. I do agree that it is unfortunate that those programs have become defunded. I think that speaks to a broader population in terms of how we fund education in this country, which I have a lot to say about, having been a teacher, but don't necessarily want to get into that at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
What I really want to come back to is this, this problem that made, for me, this research project that I was doing, this point I wanted to make, which was really simply about how do we think about intelligence, or, really the things that we take for granted about intelligence, and how we look at each other within society, particularly the elites in our country, the folks that do score high on an IQ test, do well in academia, and then end up, working for the New York Times, the Washington Post, or as a talking head on something like CNN. The things that they take for granted that then don't become part of our discourse, because exactly what Murray was describing in this book back in 1994, where he was really, trying to say that, like, our society is going to become stratified in a way where, because of the way that, higher education in our society is set up to really, anyone who is of that gifted and talented level is really going to be kind of harvested out of American public education, brought to, one of these Ivy League institutions, and then essentially credentialized, as being one of the smart kids who, can go on television, and whatever they decide to do with their life, they're generally capable of doing, and, just have a much bigger voice within the discourse because, of their intelligence as it's measured by something like the IQ test. And there's a whole nother questions to, like, is that actually a measure of intelligence? This notion of, they talk about the concept of G, which is general intelligence, because when you actually take the IQ test, it's measuring a lot of different aspects of your intellectual capacity. So they kind of group it all together, and your IQ score is supposed to represent something that may or may not exist, right? And there's a lot to get into around that as well. What is this notion of intelligence? Yes, it does predict outcomes, as we both acknowledged, within our society, but the way that we structure society, and, this test was sort of conceived of, within a Western culture, capitalist society about 100 years ago. Yeah, it's measuring a specific set of outcomes that might not actually work if you were to, say, take this same test and try to measure outcomes in ancient Egypt or some other society where having, other capabilities might serve you better. So it's psychology. It's still an early science. It's not been around as long as physics. It's really, I mean, you could say philosophy, was a precursor to everything, and there is some psychology in ancient philosophy, so you can go back a few thousand years to it, but we're still kind of figuring it out. So there's a lot of questions, and I think there's even more questions about this particular concept in particular, because it has almost become taboo. And I do want to get back to this point. The reason it's become taboo is because the dark secret that I didn't even know, back in the 90s when I was in college, is that the racial disparity, in terms of particularly populations within the United States and how they perform on these intelligence tests, is kind of staggering. The best way to talk about it is, just to say my own personal assumptions prior to actually going to the library and reading Murray's book. I remember it coming out back in 1994 and hearing about it, and there being this controversy about this book that was about IQ and intelligence, and the controversy being that there was a difference between the races. And people accused it of being sort of this eugenicist book. And I think we're all should be cautious about anything that could potentially be a case for eugenics, especially in this country. Like, we did terrible things with sterilization, 100 years ago. We don't have a good track record on it. We need to be real about that and be very careful, once we start looking into things like that. But the numbers are the numbers. And, what I remember hearing about it at the time, and, my mom is a psychologist. She's not a therapist. She's a research psychologist. As I mentioned earlier, I come from a family of academics. And I remember sort of hearing about it, talking to her about it. And the thing that I remember, sort of in terms of the racial differences from back in my 20s that sort of stuck with me was like, okay, so Asians tend to score on average about 4 points higher than white folks. And, I had taken the IQ test when I was 17, and it didn't seem like 4 points was enough to really make a fuss about. And I didn't understand why it was such a big deal until I went back to it recently. And I'd kind of assumed, the thing that people were concerned about was that the Black population within the United States scores lower on average than whites and, of course, Asians as well. My assumption had been, after hearing that Asians had scored about 4 points higher than whites, it's like, okay, well, maybe like the Black population scores like 4 points lower, right? And who cares? We're still really, most of us, clustered around, that 100. 50% of the population is going to be between 85 and 115. It's not that big of a deal. And even if you look at the United States, population on the whole, hey, we're 2 points lower than the rest of the world. The average IQ in the United States is 98, right? We're not even at 100. And we're still mostly white. Okay, so that's on the white folks. When you look at it, it's a full standard deviation, and that was the shocking thing. And for folks who are listening, and have forgotten or never had to study statistics, what that means is that the average IQ for an African American in the United States is like 85.
Are you serious?
Yeah. And
wow.
What that means then is that, and again, we have to look at this in terms of a broad population. It's not ever going to tell you anything about any individual person that you meet. Right?
Of course.
But the population as a whole, yes. Like, basically where, in an average population, 50% of the population is going to have an IQ below 100. In the African American population within the United States, 75% of the population has an IQ that's under 100. And that's a data point that is incredibly difficult to deal with, right? It's like 4 points you can kind of ignore, and there could be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe there's some slight difference, but basically we're all kind of the same. And, we've heard this statistic, like genetically, we're all 99.7% the same as humans. And
Mhm.
so, and famously, like Bill Clinton talked about this, when they first started to map the human genome. And yeah, he said, yeah, this confirms it. Like we're all really the same. And, racism and all of that, that's a bunch of nonsense. And, the Human Genome Project has proved this. And this is the very early days of the Human Genome Project, right? And it's also important to consider that when we talk about Murray's book, The Bell Curve, they were looking at twin studies. The human genome, they haven't even gotten started with it at that point. So, right, their book came out in 94. So, and I don't want to get too far ahead, and I don't know how long this conversation is going to go, because it can go into a lot of different places here. But, this is information that Murray didn't have access to when the bell curve was written. They were just looking at twin studies. It is far more complicated when you start to get into, which genes actually might have to do with something like intelligence. It's far more complicated than anybody had previously thought. And even something like eye color isn't as simple as, just being two chromosomes, interacting with each other. There's more factors to it. And I'm not a geneticist, but I've been trying to do my homework on it. And the geneticists now, they don't talk about single genes anymore. They talk about polygenetic kind of groups of genes and how they're interacting with each other and how that might influence even something as simple as eye color. But, when we get to something as complicated as intelligence and try to talk about it in a general way and say, yes, there is such a thing as general intelligence, which we can see has like predictive, capabilities in terms of looking at big populations and how social and economic outcomes play out. But at the same time, it is so complicated that like there's no way to identify a single gene. So what do we do with it when, we say like, okay, race is a construct, yet there is, this constructed race that we've had and previously enslaved and oppressed in a multitude of ways over centuries in this country is doing so much worse in what we're calling, a test of intelligence. And we feel like it's a valid test because it does predict outcomes within a society that we've created, but also, yes, that same society that we're still living in hasn't adequately dealt with the impact of its racist behavior in the past.
I just want to reflect what a sticky beast this is, right? Because I'm hearing this and I'm hearing people getting really upset about how racist this sounds, right?
Yeah.
It's so tough to talk about. And I didn't know the information that you're sharing. I was aware that there were some differences between races on IQ tests, but I also thought that they were more along the lines of a few points. I know Charles Murray has come under fire. I'm curious if you've seen, are you familiar with Charles Murray's most recent book and his debate with Coleman Hughes?
Oh, yeah, I did hear him on that Coleman Hughes podcast. And I have not read his most recent book, but I listened to at least the free portion of the Sam Harris interview that he did a few years back, which, was kind of put, Sam Harris in the crosshairs of a lot of traditional liberal folks for even just having him on and having the conversation. But yeah, I thought the Coleman Hughes interview was interesting. I think it's worth checking out. I don't necessarily agree with either of them without spoiling, what the outcome of the debate was. You're in the same position that I was in like a couple months ago when I first, scratched past the surface of this whole question. The whole reason that I, even ended up getting Murray's book from the library, which I just sort of said, okay, this is not a book to read. Everyone seems to agree it's racist. Why would I bother with it? Was that there really hasn't been a lot of books written on this subject, that you could even find at a local public library. I'm sure there's like academic journals and things like that deal with the subject matter. But, there's no like book that I could get from the Alameda Public Library that dealt with this subject past the bell curve. it almost became like something
Mm.
that just, it, like I said, it became a taboo subject to even think about it.
Yeah.
And, I do want to get to this sort of like, well, what are the two, the ways you can approach it and try to
Hmm.
figure out what's, why there's this incredible disparity. And I mean, honestly, there's three. I don't want to entertain the first one, but it does kind of seem to be, and this is really when you get down to it, the problem with Murray's book isn't that his data's wrong. It's the conclusions that they come to as a result of it, which is really like, well,
Mm.
yeah, black people just aren't as smart as white people, and that's okay. Some of them are going to be, and great. We want to welcome them to, the elite or whatever. If you're smart enough and you're black and you can go to Harvard. I mean, you even see this with like, the Republicans' embrace of somebody like Ben Carson or Alan Keyes. Like, oh yeah, you're one of the ones that like Charles Murray would give a thumbs up to because clearly you went to an elite school, you're a brain surgeon, whatever it is. Great, good for you. You're basically a white person. So welcome aboard. But
My skin is crawling.
yeah, right. So I mean, like I said, it's not really one that I want to entertain, but it is kind of why Murray has this reputation as being a racist, is because he's not willing to reconsider the other possibilities, right? So one, and this is the one that I think, within liberal circles has become what everyone kind of wants to take as the answer. And I have a whole lot of problems with that, and hopefully we can get into it. But it's basically like, well, the test is culturally biased. And the fact that the test is culturally biased means that like things like the gifted and talented program also must be culturally biased. And, a whole lot of other things. And that's how we explain this uncomfortably large gulf between the scores, right? I do want to come back to that point because the test is culturally biased in certain ways. And that's kind of why, I had taken the IQ test myself when I was 17 years old and remembered like certain portions of it where, after Charles Murray's book came out in 94 when I was in college, and this argument, was first put forward like, well, the test is culturally biased. That's why there's the difference. I mean, at that point, I could think of a couple specific things on the test where it's like, okay, I could see how this would, not be a fair question, or would be an easier question for me, considering my background than for somebody else. And it, if it was only a difference of like 4 points, then I think it would be a lot easier to just be like, well, it's culturally biased. But that's the path that, again, has been taken. And the reasons for that, I think, are really what needs to be addressed here. Because the other possibility is that there are environmental circumstances at play that account for the majority of, this disparity that we see, in terms of IQ tests. And I would say in addition to that, you also have to take into consideration that what we're looking at on the IQ test leaves a lot out. And, the cultural biases, well, I mean, I think we can put this into what's become, talked about as multiple intelligences. I find there's a lot more validity to that component of it than it just being a culturally biased thing. And I think that inevitably there's going to be cultural and environmental effects on how, people develop. But even further than that, in terms of how genetics gets activated, there's that component as well.
So you're talking about looking for a greater understanding of what could account for these racial disparities, and then how does that point to solutions? And so I hear you talking about the possible role of environmental factors. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, so I was starting to talk about epigenetics, but I think before we get into that, the factor to think about is, that I really found the most staggering was something like sodium deficiencies, right? And, after the Sudanese Civil War in the early 2000s, they looked at the diet of the population of southern Sudan, right? Sudan's a huge country. It's one of the, if not might be the biggest country in Africa. So, the population in the north and the population in the south lead very different lives. And, once they introduced iodized salt, I'm sorry, I think I said sodium deficiency, iodine deficiency.
Thank you. That makes so much more sense. Iodine deficiency.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Because I'm thinking about iodized salt, so I keep saying sodium. But if I have said sodium previously, we're talking about iodine, right? Because the way that they get iodine into a population, this is why when you go to the grocery store, you get iodized salt.
Right.
And I think they had initially discovered this, doing studies with the Americans living in Appalachia. But the most recent example of it is South Sudan, where there was a problem with iodine deficiency. And once they introduced iodized salt into the population, there's a jump of about 13 and a half points in terms of the average IQ that happens.
Wow.
Right.
That's huge.
It is huge. I mean, it is, basically would bring us back to this starting point where okay, now, if something like that was a factor, then we're talking about a much smaller gap, right? If you go from an average of about 85 for the African American population to an average, that's 98.5, right?
Well, if it were an iodine deficiency, which we don't know that it is in the US, but that would make up all of the differences. And so what I want to take from at least this chunk of information is that nutrient deficiencies, as well as environmental toxins, like you mentioned, lead poisoning, right, can really impact brain development in those early years. Because you described how IQ is fairly fixed from an early age, but I would imagine that during gestation and the first few years of life, that nutrient deficiencies, which could include iodine, could play a huge role in explaining the IQ gap, if I'm understanding you correctly. So this is really a childhood nutrition issue.
And it's potentially a childhood nutrition issue, but the research isn't getting done around those factors. And the other thing from the South Sudan study...
Hold on. I'm sorry, I just have to free associate with this, because when I think about how Asians have on average higher IQ levels, and I think about, not necessarily the diets of Asian Americans, but like the ancestral diets of people in Asia include large amounts of fish and seaweed, and iodine comes from the ocean. Fish and seaweed are high in iodine, as well as the healthy fats found in fish are really good for the brain. So just wondering if ancestral nutrition and epigenetics there might play a role in Asian success, which would point to the potential role of not only iodine, but, sea-based products or things that supply those same nutrients. But anyway, I'm just kind of extrapolating and free associating. I'm not a doctor. I just was struck by that. But you were saying about Sudan.
Nor am I. But, these are the things that, when you start to look at the environmental conditions, start to come up as okay, so these are very clear possibilities as to what could be impacting the disparity that we're looking at that nobody's really thinking about. The only other thing I wanted to bring up about the South Sudan study that I found particularly interesting was there also the levels of violence decreased, right? And the tendency towards violent reaction to challenging situations all
decreased with iodine, with iodine supplementation?
Salt. Yep.
Oh, wow.
Right. So, I'm not sure, I haven't found anything, but, I know from teaching in North Philadelphia, food deserts are a real thing. And if you've got kids that in a lot of places, the default when you buy a bag of potato chips at the store, the salt that's in those potato chips is kosher, which means it's not iodized. Same thing with a lot of school lunches. You're not getting iodized salt unless your mom's got, a can of iodized salt on the shelf. And, maybe if you go out to a diner or a restaurant, but in a lot of places, simply to be compliant with being kosher, you're not going to get it from a restaurant. you're not necessarily going to get it unless you specifically, have someone at home who's cooking for you, which a lot of my students, in North Philly didn't have that on a consistent basis. The most regular meal they were getting was their school lunch. So, but that's a factor. I don't know, I would assume at this point in the United States, iodized salt is common enough that it shouldn't really have that level of an impact. But, when you talk about like housing and redlining and, the historical impacts of that, as well as things like what we see happening in Flint, Michigan, where there's, lead in the water and we really haven't done anything to get it out. That's something that really happens across the country, not necessarily, on a, municipality-wide basis like what you see in Flint, Michigan. But, certainly in terms of individual housing that isn't being kept up, again, back in Philadelphia, there's a lot of folks that are just living in row homes that are 100 plus years old and haven't had a lot of maintenance. So they were built, cheap for factory workers 100 years ago. And yeah, you're kind of lucky if they're not falling down. There's potentially a lot of different elements here that could be impacting things.
I don't know what data we have on the specific roles of other nutrient deficiencies and how those can affect IQ in particular. It could be that iodine is one of the biggest factors in determining brain health and early development, but it would not at all surprise me if other nutrient deficiencies early in life played a role. And I think what this points to is the cycle of poverty and the food deserts and poor childhood nutrition then impacting IQ and then keeping the poor poor. And
Exactly.
What's really striking to me about this conversation is that you started off kind of bravely saying some uncomfortable truths that I could imagine a lot of people having a big reaction to, right? Like talking about the fact that there is an IQ gap between the races could be easily called racist and the discussion could be stopped there. But by talking about it and researching, you uncover more information. Not that you or I are policymakers or experts in these fields. We're just curious, intellectually driven people. But still, we're modeling that by talking about it and looking at the data and forming hypotheses and testing them, that we can actually potentially make progress. Because if we were to identify, well, yes, there is a gap in racial outcomes, and it looks like it's caused by a food desert. It looks like supplementing iodized salt or, providing other nutrients or food education or food resources could actually be a solution to the problem. It's by talking about things that are uncomfortable that we can start to get somewhere.
Absolutely.
And I want to say, too, that I'm reminded of a conversation I was having last night. I was in this great little group of people that it was a diverse crowd. We had a Black feminist and a white Republican libertarian. We just had people of all walks of life. And we were just having a really nice, civil, nuanced conversation. And I remember we were talking about affirmative action and how some of the Black people in the room felt about affirmative action. And I guess some people in the room hadn't heard some of the things that I've heard about how now in the schools they're saying that math is racist. And one of the things that people are doing to promote so-called racial equity is to lower the achievement standards for Black kids. And the Black people in the room were so insulted by this. I mean, one of them was like, I love math. But the problem is my family didn't support me loving math. I had, my family wanted me to be a musician. So thank goodness I had teachers who supported me. And we were talking about what are the ramifications of lowering academic standards for certain students. My extrapolating from that is that if you, let's say, hold Black students to lower standards than other students, then they're less equipped for the job market, so they're less likely to get hired. That's not helping anybody. Or they're hired to fulfill a demographic requirement at a company, but they're not the most qualified person for the job. And then the company doesn't do as well, or the nonprofit or whatever doesn't do as well. So either way, lowering the standards is not the answer, but solving the problems that are contributing to achievement gaps is much more important, right? For creating better outcomes. And so in order to do that, we can't just say it's racist that, our standards are racist and therefore we have to eliminate our standards, or math is racist and therefore we have to eliminate math. We actually need math to analyze the problem. We need math and science to analyze it and identify what's actually going to help people, because lowering standards and dismissing entire fields doesn't help people. But what does help people is using our intellects to try to understand where problems are coming from and then what solutions those might point to. So I'm just really glad that we're having this conversation. Not that you or I are in a position to do anything about it, but I think at least we're modeling for the world that by saying things that are hard to say and looking at things that are unpleasant, you can grapple with them and learn and search for solutions.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm certainly, we're not going to solve it as two white folks living on the West Coast. Our perspective is pretty limited. I mean, I'll speak for myself. I realize that it makes it that much more awkward to bring up like a lot of this stuff. What I would say is not that like we should lower standards, particularly in math. You're absolutely right. We need math, and we should value people that excel at math. It's incredibly helpful in our society. We need it. What I would say is that we should broaden standards. And, I think that what we have to be critical of, on the other end of it is not only, okay, so what are the environmental factors that could be influencing this? And I wouldn't necessarily put this in the category of critiquing something like the IQ test as being culturally biased, right? It is that for other reasons, as I mentioned earlier, and I can bring up a specific if you want to go back to it. But I do want to say that I think the other end of it is that we do have to look at like, what is it that we're measuring against? And, we're measuring it against academic success. And I think we should also look at like, okay, if the IQ test is an accurate predictor of academic success, then maybe what the academy values should be broadened to consider capabilities that aren't measured by the IQ test. And I would say that for a society generally, if you look at the job market, I mean, really, the thing that struck me about Murray's book is that, okay, what the IQ test actually measures is the level of value that you have that can be extracted from your labor for the sake of capital and investment, right? If you score well on the IQ test and can go to an elite school, there is a very calculated assessment of the value of your labor, coming out of it. And Wall Street will gladly hire you to, create some algorithm that can make microtransactions that skim off of everybody else's trading so that somebody can make billions of dollars who backed that investment in the first place. Really, that's what it tells you, right? If we had a society that wasn't simply directed towards the extraction of value from, either the environment or the labor force's capabilities, we might, consider somebody's musical talents as much as we consider their mathematical capabilities on something like the IQ test. And I did well on the IQ test, but if there was a portion of the IQ test where I had to put notes in the correct order, I would have done terrible at it, right? But the IQ test doesn't measure that. It also doesn't measure whether or not you're colorblind. It doesn't measure how quickly you can think of a rhyme. And there's an awful lot that doesn't clearly represent value that can be extracted from your work that the IQ test just doesn't consider. And I think that's the other component that we need to look at. And I think both runaway capitalism needs to be critiqued from that standpoint, but also the way that the academy values, and the academy has just changed. I mean, it's certainly has not always been like this. The shift towards, STEM as being the only real classes and like the hard science and this fascination with being able to measure everything. Yeah, there is some value to that, but there is also a great deal of value in terms of what expands the quality of human life and human experience to, be able to appreciate things that are immeasurable, that are created by people that might not be mathematically gifted or might not be gifted in terms of their visual, spatial capabilities. But, again, going back to this notion of multiple intelligence, there's things that the IQ test doesn't measure that, brings, I think, great and profound meaning into, the lives of most people.
The goal here should be both and thinking, right? That
Yes.
we don't have to get rid of something that is a valid measure of what it's a valid measure of in order to acknowledge its limitations and add considerations for other things. I would add to the list physical skills, which I think are highly undervalued in this,
Absolutely.
Internet age, and emotional intelligence and creativity, although there is correlation between creativity and IQ. I will say, though, that, again, speaking as a mental health professional with a trauma history, that I do think intelligence plays a big role in resilience, and that all else being equal, people who have experienced the same hardships, those who have higher intellectual capacities, generally tend to have better outcomes when it comes to being able to sort of psychologically metabolize what has happened to them and still find a meaningful path forward in their lives. So I think it is a factor, and I'm curious about how we can continue having honest conversations about intelligence where applicable, because it is applicable in many domains, while also working to resolve inequities and also acknowledging the value of that which cannot be measured by IQ tests.
Absolutely. And I will say on the resilience point, the one thing and this just occurred to me as you were saying it, it is an awful lot easier to be resilient when you're living in a society that values your capabilities more and is more ready to reward you for them. I've been through my share of difficulties, but I just know, not only as a white man who's very tall and has an above average IQ, that I've been able to bounce back much more easily than the special education students that I was teaching 10 years ago when they faced hardship. And I think, yeah, intelligence probably does play a factor there, but I also think, being in a world that is always reminding you that you're valuable makes it a lot easier to be resilient too. And, if we were to, be able to create a society that kind of reminded everyone, or at least looked for what value they could bring to society, rather than kind of just dropping people into these buckets of like, well, you're going to be a great ditch digger and we don't really value that, but good luck with it. And how, this is back to the political aspect of it that we were talking about earlier. I mean, I think when you look at Trump and like all of the people that voted for Trump, it really was just that, like, he said to them, like, hey, I believe all of you matter. Well, Hillary Clinton was telling people who'd spent their entire lives, working in a coal mine that, like, well, we're going to retrain you so you can learn how to code. And that doesn't realistically take into consideration intellectual diversity and the fact that, like, you're not going to teach every coal miner to learn how to code, because there's a lot of people that are working in a coal mine because they weren't good at math, because they didn't do well in school, and they're not going to be able to pull themselves up by their intellectual bootstraps to somehow learn how to code and move to San Francisco. It's not happening. You have to, like, have a society that recognizes that people who don't succeed in STEM still should have a place within the world and be able to contribute in a meaningful way. And we should try to look for ways to do that. I mean, this is really why, like, the Andrew Yang thing caught on, and why, like, everyone in Silicon Valley is kind of like, yeah, we can hire some token black people, or, whatever you want us to do to make us look like we're woke. the reason that folks in Silicon Valley are keen on the idea of UBI is they really don't see an economic future where manual labor is going to be something that we need anymore. And you can't just, you have to do something with this population that's in the middle of the country that didn't get recruited to an elite school, that, 60% of the American population didn't even go into higher education.
So I don't know enough about UBI. I haven't researched Andrew Yang's proposals in depth. So I don't feel like I know enough to comment on that. But I do have sort of an instinctual negative reaction when I think about a vision of a world in which people don't have enough to do. And that's also what I hear you talking about, that it's really important for anyone, regardless of their abilities, to feel like they have something of value to contribute. And if that is in the physical world, all the better. I like to talk about the importance of hobbies and the importance of meaningful work and community engagement. And I think you're right to point out that that's a major factor in resilience, regardless of intelligence or other skills. Simply having a job or a volunteer position or an important role within one's social network or a hobby in which you create something that's of value to you, whether that's personal or objective value out in the larger world, being able to create or do or contribute or participate is so important for mental health and resilience. I absolutely agree with you on that point.
Yeah, this is, I was not personally making the case for UBI. I have mixed feelings about it. I'm saying, someone who works in the technology sphere in the Bay Area, the reason that it is a popular idea is because, yes, people like Andrew Yang generally are like, we can't just leave these people to fend for themselves. We have to do something, but we can't necessarily employ them given the rate at which technology is advancing. What I would suggest, it seems to be more like what you're thinking of, is that no, it's actually everyone deserves meaningful work and deserves to feel like they can contribute to the society that they're a part of. And I would much prefer that, we take a more community-based approach to, figuring out, what is it that people can contribute in a world where, maybe we don't need people doing physical labor all the time to manufacture the things that we need to live, right? Like, we don't need people plowing the fields anymore. We have these gigantic tractors that do it much more efficiently than any human being can. So we need to think about the society that we live in and what we can do so that regardless of where you fall on the bell curve in terms of IQ, we're able to make an assessment of what your capabilities are and what you might actually do well at. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that is going to generate capital for somebody who already has a lot of money, right? I think that's kind of the perspective to take to it, is like, how do we create a world where all the citizens that we have feel like they have something meaningful that they can bring to the table.
Yeah, that's so important. And preferably at least some of it be offline.
Yes.
I think that's a great take home message.
Yeah, for sure. I think involvement, within your immediate community in some way is really where I would start. But, again, this is something I've been trying to put together a video essay for it. I'm still in the process of researching and writing. Hopefully I'll have it out in the next month or so, or at least the first component of it. But, I don't have any of the answers. And I think the reason why, I don't even feel like I'm close to any of the answers. And the big thing that I really, wanted to kind of come on and bring up is the fact that just this question has become taboo. And, within, the elite class, the reason it's really come back to the test itself and trying to invalidate it as being, this thing that it just must be culturally biased in some way. Or as you mentioned earlier, mathematics, that's culturally biased now. Well, the other alternative is that there are environmental factors at play, that there would actually have to be significant resources invested into changing and fixing. And none of the elites want to do that. It's much easier to just blame it on the test and to close down, gifted and talented programs and things like that, and just be like, well, this whole idea of intelligence or the IQ test, even measuring anything that's worth looking at, that's racist in and of itself. That's why the topic has become so taboo. There really hasn't been a popular book that deals with this subject since Charles Murray wrote The Bell Curve in 1994. There has actually been one that came out recently actually I have it right here. It's called The Genetic Lottery, Why DNA Matters for Social Equality by Catherine Page Hardin, which I'd recommend.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, it is. And she's the one that really looks at the genetic component of it and how the mapping of the human genome impacts all of this. But she's really getting to a lot of the same points that Murray brought up, 30 years ago or whatever. And looking at it from, the standpoint of a geneticist and she's way more liberal than Murray is, right? She's not a conservative. So she ends up drawing different conclusions. But, the data is the same, and it is something that we can't not address. Like, you can't pretend that the way that society is structured and the way that it's heading is just going to leave behind at least half of the population.
Well, you brought up some really important points, and I'm so glad that we're having this conversation. I'm glad that, you're one of the first guests that I'm having on the show, and I think it's a great introduction to the topic of intelligence because we're framing it in a way that's courageous and nuanced and compassionate. I will also be having on my show Jessie Manisto, I believe is her last name, of Third Factor magazine. She talks about giftedness, and that's what her work is about. So there will definitely be a follow-up conversation on this topic, and I'm really curious to see what you're going to come up with. I know it's been several weeks since you and I last checked in, but you did say that you were working on some projects. Do you have a name or any more information for anyone who's curious about your work, or is that still underway?
Well, so I haven't posted anything yet on YouTube. If you're interested in following me, Twitter is probably the best place. I don't post all that much, but when I do actually start putting some of this content out, I will post links from that account. That's just going to be at Diablo Neruda, DiabloNeruda. If I do anything interesting, I will surely post about it there. Hopefully, you'll have me back on when I actually do get something live, and I'll be able to talk about it a little bit more. But that's where I would start. The YouTube channel I have created, but there's no content on it. It's just called True Believer. And I will hopefully be doing more video essay type stuff after this one, dealing with these sort of unstated assumptions that we collectively hold, but don't really consider.
Dirk Van Leeuwen, it's been so great having you on my show. Really happy we were able to do this, and I hope people check out your work.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast with Stephanie Wynn, LMFT. This podcast is produced by Eric and Amber Beals at Different Mix. Special thanks to the talented musician Joey Pecoraro for our theme song, Half Awake. At sometherapist.com, you can find more information on any topic, guest, resource, product, or service you've heard of here today. You can also follow me on Twitter or Instagram at sometherapist. If you would like to ask a question, suggest a topic, be a guest, or invite me to speak, you can email us at hello@sometherapist.com. You can also send us a voice memo with your question, and we just might play it. Of course, just because I'm some therapist doesn't mean I'm your therapist. This podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. If you need help, ask your doctor or browse your local therapists online. And whatever you do next, please take care of yourself. Eat well, sleep well, move your body, get outside, and tell someone you love them. You're worth it.